I am delighted today to be able to introduce Dr. Eleanor Newbigin, who is currently a research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge in the UK, and who in September will take up a lectureship at the School for Oriental and African Studies in London in the history department. Eleanor works on topics as diverse as the state and its relationship with Indian society, 1919 to the 1960s, gender, family and law, and urban middle-class identity and cultures of consumption in India from the 1930s to the present. She has published articles in Modern Asian Studies and the Indian Economic and Social History Review. And what you're going to be hearing today is actually a chapter, as I understand it, from her current book project. The title of the book project is The Hindu Family and the Origins of Indian Democracy. So we're very lucky to have her, and I'll hand over the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming to a talk that has income tax in the title. Though maybe you were lured here by the words secular and democracy, which obviously seem to, people don't sort of look at me in with quite the same funny expression when I say I work on secularism in India as they do when I say I'm working on income tax. And secular democracy and secularism in India have received a great deal more attention from scholars of South Asia than has income tax so far. Since the rise of Hindu nationalist groups in India towards the end of the 1980s, there's been a growing interest in what's often seen as a battle between secular democracy and right-wing Hindu nationalism in India. Both in academic literature, but also in popular news coverage and commentary, these political events are often presented in terms of a crisis, both of Indian secularism and Indian democracy. A view that rests on the assumption that prior to this, the Indian state was a democracy quite untainted by religious identity. My work really challenges this view. My main argument is this, that far from undermining or eroding the relationship between religious identity and political authority, the emergence of representative politics in India established a unique bond between the state and the Hindu family. As this paper explores, this bond was firmly rooted in constitutional and financial reforms made immediately after World War I. State expansion and devolution committed the late-colonial administration to finding new and sustainable sources of funding to support the much expanded state structure. The development of a graded system of income taxation provided one way of increasing government revenue in the long term. In most cases, this led the administration to monitor more closely the income of individual subjects, but not in the case of the Hindu family. Colonial officials had long regarded the Hindu family as highly peculiar, particularly in relation to the way that it held property, which was as a single joint unit. As they began to draw up the new income tax laws, they realised that it was more lucrative to tax the Hindu family as a single financial collective than to break it down into individual payers. Through these measures, the government of India thus established a system of political representation framed in the language of individual representation, but which was funded through a taxation policy grounded in Hindu law and a focus on group rights. And this argument offers new insight into the religious origins of the Indian democratic state, but also to the relationship between colonial rule and the Hindu family. A number of scholars have already written extensively on the way in which colonial rule impacted upon Hindu family structures and practices. Tanika Sarkar, Partha Chatterjee, and others have shown how the colonial policy of religious neutrality often worked in tandem with the interests of Indian male elites, helping to co-opt them into the colonial project. State power in the public realm was tolerated on the basis that the private realm of the home remained under the authority of Hindu men, with women coming to be seen as symbolic keepers of a pure Hindu identity that was strictly policed and defined by men. In looking at this process, historians have focused almost exclusively on personal or family law. With the exception of Ritu Birla's recent work on indigenous capitalism, historians have largely ignored the way in which income tax policy impacted upon Indian social structures and, above all, the Hindu family. As I hope to show, looking at the post-war debates about income tax actually helps us to understand better why Hindu law and the Hindu family have developed in the manner that they have, as well as the implications of this for the operation of Indian secularism. Studies of Hindu law have shown how the interwar years were a very formative period for the refashioning of Indian patriarchy. I'm thinking here particularly of work by Mithili Srinivas and Mrinalini Sinha, who've shown that the 20s and 30s see a number of bills to reform Hindu personal law. And these bills really culminate in a grand project, the Hindu Code Bill. Between 1941 and 1956, lawyers and legislators worked to draw up a clear code of Hindu family law to replace the existing system that was based on case law and custom. Reform of colonial income tax after World War I provided a crucial but a much ignored backdrop for these reforms. As I will show, the new income tax legislation committed the late colonial and then the early post-colonial state to specific financial interests that placed important limits on the way in which Hindu law could be changed in spite of legislators' promises. And this story really begins with World War I and its impact on colonial financial policy. When war broke out in 1914, the Indian economy was in a surprisingly decent shape, with central government officials predicting a surplus of just over £1 million when they presented the 1914 budget. The situation soon began to change as global trade contracted and imperial demands for financial and military aid began to increase. And by the end of 1915, the government of India was looking for ways to raise considerable sums of money very quickly, but also because no end to the war was in sight, they knew that they needed to do this through a structure that could be sustained in the long term. It couldn't just be a quick hit kind of a tax. And on that basis, they turned to income tax. The first formal Income Tax Act, I'm using my PowerPoint somewhat like a footnotes, so these are just sort of details of the bill, which I won't go into, hopefully I'll explain in brief, but these are intended to help you, or I hope that they do. So the first formal Income Tax Act had been drawn up by the Government of India in 1886. The tax was never a particularly lucrative source of revenue, but was more of a symbolic measure. It was an expressly non-agricultural tax, designed to spread the burden of tax collection from landholders who'd long funded the state to include merchants and professionals. And under the 1886 Act, all companies, firms, partnerships, and salaried individuals earning more than 2,000 rupees a year had to pay income tax. How much tax depended on where that income came from. And the Act divided earnings into 4 categories. Any taxpayer earning more than 500 rupees in any of these one sources paid a flat rate of tax on every rupee that exceeded this 500 rupee limit, which was 4 to 5 paise depending on the category. So I haven't quite worked this out, but I guess if you earn only 2,000 rupees in the year and that it's absolutely spread evenly across all 4 categories, you don't pay any tax. Whereas if you earn 1,500 rupees from company profits, you're taxed on 1,000 rupees of that. So in the conditions of the war, the finance member William Mayer began to radically revise these provisions. Seeking to lessen the burden on lower income taxpayers and glean more from those with higher incomes, Mayer abandoned the flat rate system and introduced a new model of progressive taxation with a sliding scale of charges on incomes from 5,000 to 25,000 rupees. That kind of leads to a scale that looks something like that. And the new income tax reforms were accompanied by a slate of other financial measures. So by the end of 1916, the Government of India was able to report that it had raised £750,000 more than the £3.6 million that Mayer had originally predicted his changes would bring in. Of this additional revenue, 130,000, or just a bit under 20%, had come from income tax. The new Income Tax Act was followed a year later by a Super Tax Act, which levied additional charges on non-agricultural incomes in excess of 50,000 rupees. The 1917 Act imposed a sliding scale of charges ranging from 1 to 3 annas on these high-end incomes, and so was in many ways an extension of the 1916 income tax reforms. The Government of India cited wartime pressures in order to introduce both the 1916 and the 17 tax acts, but unsurprisingly, they were keen to protect these new sources of revenue once the war was over. And in many ways, the war itself had triggered a series of events that made it imperative for the state to retain and protect these measures. Constitutional reforms, undertaken in part as a reward for Indians' contributions to the imperial war effort, served to expand greatly the structure of the colonial state. The model of diarchic government, introduced under the 1919 Government of India Act, extended the apparatus of state as well as the responsibilities of government. The legislative assemblies were enlarged, along with the Indian franchise, and public works and nation-building programmes were transferred to the provincial councils for management by Indian representatives. But all this had to be paid for. Financial reform was therefore as important as political devolution in this process of constitutional restructuring. In spite of the wartime reforms, land revenue remained the single most important source of revenue for the state. But it was fairly fixed and unresponsive. It was hard to raise rates very quickly and very hard to get more out of this revenue source without considerable financial investment. And the government wanted to make money, not spend it. Income tax, on the other hand, seemed to show much potential for long-term growth without much financial input. One needed to keep the economy healthy, but Mayer had shown how tax policy and changes in how one levied income tax could raise yields very quickly. Having invoked the immediate financial imperatives of the war to press through the reforms and the introduction of the income tax reforms and the introduction of super tax, colonial officials now argued that they needed to retain these taxes in order to pay for political devolution. At the same time, officials remained deeply cautious of the possibility that tax could invoke social unrest. The Indian franchise was expanded on the basis of literacy and property qualifications, criteria that enabled large numbers of Indian industrialists, merchants and professionals, or in other words, the income and super tax paying communities, to register for the vote. In this way, the 1919 Government of India Act served to formalise and further the relationship between the state and the constituency of taxpayers that had greatly expanded during the war. The new constitution forced the administration to expand its revenue base, but it also raised questions about how that revenue was to be distributed within government. There's not time in this paper to deal with the complexities of the Meston settlement, which set out the new federal division of finances under the 1919 Act, nor to really discuss the tensions that provoked, but it served to highlight the growing importance of income tax for the new constitutional framework. The settlement redistributed taxes on the basis of existing rather than potential revenue yields. Provincial councils were given control over land revenue in order to pay for the new political programmes, while smaller tax sources, including income tax, were given to the centre. In other words, the new constitution passed on to the provinces responsibilities that were likely to require the greatest amount of financial flexibility, the running of public works, health and education services, while also granting them the least responsive forms of state revenue. Devolution raised new expectations of what the state could provide for its subjects, without providing the necessary income to secure this. As a result, government officials, both at the centre and the provinces, spent the 1920s trying to balance a budget in which expenditure always remained in excess of income. Given the experiences of the war, altering the structures of income taxation seemed one way in which the government might be able to manage this difficult situation. And between 1918 and 1922, there was much debate about and revision of the Wartime Tax Acts. The 1916 Income Tax Act was revised in 1918, the Super Tax Act in 1920, and then both acts were completely overhauled and the two tax systems were amalgamated in the 1922 Income Tax Act. And the main aim of these reforms was to maximise income tax yield. Many of the changes introduced in the revised acts were designed to allow officials to place taxpayers in the highest tax brackets possible. In the most part, this involved closer scrutiny of the individual's income levels, but there was one exception to this. In the case of the Hindu family, tax officials refused to consider individual income levels, insisting that it could only be taxed as a single unit. And the root of this seeming contradiction lay in the way in which income tax legislation had evolved before the war. Maximising revenue collection had always been the major incentive in forming colonial tax policy, yet the 1886 Act had been drawn up in an era where the state didn't have the same manpower or infrastructure that it possessed in 1919. The most important thing, therefore, was to assess taxpayers in a way that would ensure that their incomes were simply in excess of the 2,000 rupees mark, and then to establish where this income came from. And the 1886 Act set out two categories of taxpayers: companies and persons. Sorry, I'm not used to the wind here, which seems to have got my nose going. So companies and persons. In terms of income tax, both groups were assessed in the same way. So tax was levied on the entire income of either a company or a person. The division had more to do with recent reforms in company law and the 1882 Indian Companies Act, which set out that an incorporated company comprised individual shareholders who had various rights and responsibilities for the financial well-being of the company. In separating companies from persons, the Income Tax Act acknowledged the legal difference in principle, but not in the practice of tax collection. All trading groups that were not registered under the Companies Act were considered to be persons for the sake of taxation. And the Act explicitly stated that the Hindu undivided family was to be included in this category. And it's just important to explain this term, the Hindu undivided family. Many Indians were understood to be part of a joint family in terms of living practices, that is, a number of generations living together in some kind of communal arrangement. But this term took on a very specific legal meaning in relation to the Hindu family under British rule. In Anglo-Hindu law, a Hindu man held self-acquired property as an individual, but Hindu ancestral property was owned by male family members as a coparcenary, that is, as a single unit, not as a collection of individuals. The family was considered the property owner, not a sort of a body of individual property owners. So in terms of business dealings, many Indian firms were managed by families and operated through kinship connections. But the distinctive way in which a Hindu family owned property meant that a Hindu family firm was understood to rest on quite a different pattern of investment as compared to non-Hindu family businesses. In Muslim law, where individual property rights were acknowledged, a family firm would look something like a sort of a non-Indian or a sort of a British firm. But the Hindu undivided family was really seen to be the sole investor in this firm. And colonial officials used the term Hindu undivided family, or HUF, to refer to this very specific arrangement of business capital and investment. And the 1916 Act introduced new differences to the way in which a company and person were assessed, which had important implications for the HUF. All taxpayers continued to be assessed on the basis of their total income, but a company shareholder was now permitted to apply for a rebate in cases where the rate of tax that the company paid was higher than the rate that he paid on his individual income. This was all part of Mayer's drive to shift the tax burden away from those with small incomes towards wealthier subjects. For example, an investor with a relatively modest income might buy only a small number of shares in a very large, highly lucrative company that paid a very high percentage of tax on its earnings. While it was right to tax the company at the highest rate possible, Mayer argued, it was unfair to make the small investor pay a larger share of his income in tax than if he'd made the same amount of money from other means. The shareholder was thus allowed to apply for a rebate to cover the difference between the level of tax he paid as an individual and the level paid by the company. Taxpayers in the persons category weren't offered the same kind of relief, even in cases where these persons were in fact made up of individual members, such as the HUF or other firms. Only companies are allowed this rebate. Registration under the Companies Act meant that the administration could monitor the income of company shareholders in a manner that wasn't possible with members of firms and HUFs. Officials also argued that whereas the Companies Act defined shareholders' rights in a company, there was no equivalent legal precedent for acknowledging the financial interests of individual members of a firm or HUF. This policy of allowing rebates to company shareholders alone was also adopted in the 1917 Supertax Act. And the way in which that act worked was that the tax was only levied on the undivided profits of a company, that is, whatever a company still had after it had paid its debts and had paid all its profits to shareholders, for a very similar reason, to avoid the double taxation of wealth, to avoid taxing it as company profits and then again as shareholder profits. And the 1916 and 17 Acts raised revenue levels, but they also created administrative problems. Company officials complained that they were being asked to monitor total income levels using bureaucratic machinery that was designed to focus on income source. In October 1917, the government of India introduced a bill to correct these problems in relation to income tax. The practice of dividing income according to source was abolished, and for the first time it became compulsory for businesses to submit a statement of income to income tax officials, which greatly facilitated the state's surveillance of their earnings. The new Income Tax Act also extended the shareholder rebate policy. Under its terms, partners in a firm who, though not registered under the Company Act, had taken out a legal deed of partnership were allowed to apply for these rebates. But again, this wasn't extended to any firms that weren't registered in this way. and wasn't extended to the Hindu family. And the decision sparked strong opposition from several Hindu legislators who argued that the new act discriminated against Hindu trading families. One of these, Rao Bahadur Sharma, a non-official member of the legislature from Madras, called on the government to allow Hufs to register their membership in a manner similar to a partnership deed. Income tax should then be calculated, he argued, as if the family had been formally partitioned, i.e. as if this joint relationship had been dissolved legally. And a collector could assess how much tax a family member would pay if he was financially independent in this way, if he was really dissolved from the family. And then the amount of tax that would be paid by an individual member would be calculated to create a cap on the amount of tax that the single Huf would pay. And this is a complicated plan, but essentially what it would mean that in larger families where you have more members, they would essentially have they'd have smaller shareholdings, if such a thing existed, would pay less tax, and that the amount of tax would be added together and the family would then pay at that level. So larger families would essentially pay less tax. The government of India wasn't keen to accept Sharma's proposal, but neither did they feel that they could reject it outright. Instead, they agreed to circulate it amongst provincial governments to gauge their views. If it won support, the government would consider incorporating it into the Act. It did not. Tax collectors complained that it would mean considerably more work for their staff. A number of finance officials argued that the proposals could not be applied because they contravened the basic principles of Hindu law. William Haley, Chief Commissioner of Delhi, argued that one of the main legal features of the Hindu joint family was that individual shares in a family estate were only clear at the moment of partition and didn't exist before that happened. It was thus a legal impossibility to define family members' shares in a Huf estate in the manner that Sharma had suggested. A.C. Chatterjee of the UP government wondered whether it was even possible to calculate the subdivision of joint families' income and therefore their taxation revenue. Ambiguity about the Huf status as a family structure and/or firm made it hard to establish if the membership of a Hindu firm should include not only those actively involved in trade, but the wider kinship network. Chatterjee explained that under Hindu law, a male child, the moment he's born, is entitled to a share in the family property. Did this mean that he'd be given a stake in the Hindu family firm if its membership was registered? Chatterjee argued that Sharma's proposals would create, quote, endless opportunities of tax evasion, end quote, which he was convinced subjects would undoubtedly exploit. Quote, shares could and would be assigned to children in order to lower rates, he insisted. It was this, the potential threat to revenue yield, that was really at the heart of official opposition to Sharma's proposals. Local officers warned that to allow members of a Hindu family to register their separate shares would lead to the dissolution of the high tax-paying Huf into individual taxpayers whose personal income would either fall below the tax threshold or would be eligible to a much lower level of tax. The income tax collector of Bombay warned that the move to individual assessment of the members of Hufs in his constituency, quote, would result in the reduction of more than 50% in the revenue now received in Bombay from the Hindu traders. I mean, this is not backed up by any firm evidence in these sources, but this is immediate responses to Sharma's proposals. And the secretary to the Chief Commissioner of Assam stated that under the proposed amendment, Hindu merchants in his province would pay 1/3 less income tax than under the current system. But it was concurrent debates about super tax that provided the final death blow for Sharma's proposals. 1 year after the Super Tax Act had been inaugurated, officials began to sound notes of warning about its operation. While the Act brought in much revenue, a number of collectors expressed concern that it wasn't producing as large a financial yield as they'd expected. The problem lay, they argued, in the fact that the Act taxed the undivided profits of a company. Officials reported that in order to avoid taxation, companies were distributing almost all of their income amongst shareholders, thereby affecting tax revenue, but also stymieing company development. So profits were just simply being handed out to shareholders, meaning that there was very little left in the pot for super tax that would be under the 50,000 rupees mark. The government agreed that this loophole needed to be closed as soon as possible. As they began to revise the Act, officials considered other aspects of its operation. Returns for 1917 showed that the number of Hufs who paid super tax was considerably lower than the number of firms and companies. This was in fact in line with the government's own predictions. In first proposing the Super Tax Act, the government had sought to allay Hindu opposition by explaining that this was a measure directed primarily at companies. I doubt if there will be very many Hindu families who will be taxed at all, a senior secretary in the Revenue Department had told Hindu representatives. In their concern about company tax evasion, administrators seemed to forget about this statement entirely. And the government had also offered Hindu legislators an incentive to support super tax. The Act had included provisions that permitted the Huff earning above the super tax threshold to deduct maintenance costs before assessment, covering costs seen to relate to family rather than business concerns, such as weddings and other religious ceremonies. This maintenance was offered as a tax incentive equivalent to the policy of taxing a company's undivided profits. But in the debate about companies' abuse of super tax, the seeming similarity between these policies meant that the Huff maintenance allowance also became the target of government suspicion. The accounts submitted under the Companies Act meant that the government possessed firm evidence of the way in which companies were distributing a significant share of their profits to avoid super tax charges. That Huffs were not registered in the same way, and the fact that officials had no information for whom and how this maintenance money was being used, was now cited as evidence of tax evasion. The super tax debate seemed to reinforce the way in which A.C. Chatterjee had presented the Huff as an uncivic and money-grabbing structure, its members willing to lie about membership in order to avoid paying tax. Officials became convinced that, far from allowing tax officials to monitor how maintenance was spent, Sharma's proposals would provide more unfair privileges for a trading unit that didn't deserve them. As a result, they called for the law to be changed in order to tighten up the level of tax collected from companies and Huffs. In February 1920, the Government of India introduced a bill to revise the Super Tax Act that levied charges on a company's annual profits before distribution. Shareholders could still make rebate claims, but they would have to apply for this once the tax had been levied. In the case of the Hindu family, the government simply removed the Huff's claims to maintenance allowance altogether. Under the new bill, companies were charged at a flat rate of 1 anna in the rupee on all profits over 50,000 rupees. The Huff, individuals and other non-registered firms were to be assessed against a graded system that began at 1 anna and rose to 3 annas in the rupee. The Huff was seen as being like a company in terms of taxation problems, but treated quite differently in terms of taxation solutions. And these proposals sparked even more outrage amongst Hindu legislators than the earlier tax measures. Sharma accused the government of betrayal. He'd asked officials to consider the hardships facing the Huff under existing tax legislation. But rather than remove these difficulties, he complained, the government had made the situation even worse. Several other legislators also expressed their anger, arguing that the government had gone too far in simply imposing these changes without consultation with Hindu representatives. This scared government officials, and while they were doggedly committed to raising revenue yields, they remained very wary of public opposition to tax policy. Officials' discussions about Sharma's registration proposals had demonstrated the importance of preserving the special tax status of the Huff for higher tax yields. Officials realised that they needed to keep Hindu taxpayers on side if they were going to continue to collect revenue on this basis. Government officials disputed Sharma's accusations that they were trying to persecute the Hindu family, but indicated that they were willing to negotiate on the provisions of the new bill. Seizing this opportunity, Sharma proposed that the Huff tax threshold be raised from 50,000 to 75,000 rupees. He argued that this extra 25,000 rupees would provide compensation for the Huff's special familial responsibilities and for the way in which it was penalised through collective taxation. Tax from undivided Hindu families didn't run to more than 12 lakhs, he argued, and this amount came largely from richer families with incomes well over 75,000 rupees, who would still be taxed under his amendment. On this basis, that it wouldn't heavily affect tax collections, the government accepted Sharma's amendment. The 1920 Super Tax Act didn't provide financial relief to the Hindu business community, but it was significant because it established the Huff as a unique category of taxpayer in government policy. The Huff had its own special super tax threshold, but the Act also set out that it would be taxed like a company at a flat rate and not according to the bracketed system used for all other non-company taxpayers. Whereas the Huff had always been seen as one example of a general category of taxpayers, the person, the 1920 Super Tax Act marked out the Hindu undivided family as wholly distinct from any other kind of taxpayer, company, or person. This status was further affirmed 2 years later in the 1922 Income Tax Act, a measure that forms the legal framework of income tax policy in India today. Ongoing financial difficulties led the government to form a committee on income tax, which met over the course of 1921 to investigate ways to improve the existing legislation. Their proposals became the 22 Act. Under this measure, income and super tax were amalgamated so that they remained two separate taxes but were now managed under one Act. Unlike the previous tax acts, the 1922 measure was an act of definition and procedure so that the process of raising and lowering taxation rates was separated from its tax setting, so that tax rates were set on an annual basis by a finance bill separately from the main tax acts themselves. As the new finance bill setting the rates had to be approved by an Indian majority legislature, it was also part of the government's policy of co-opting taxpayers into this new framework of financial and political governance. The 22 Act marked the culmination of the reform process that had been sparked by World War I. The Act established the principle of taxing individual incomes as the basis for assessment in terms of company, partnership, and firm profits. The members of all these trading entities were allowed to claim refunds on the tax levied on their business profits on the condition that they submitted accounts to the state detailing their individual income. The Hindu undivided family was the one financial structure that was exempt from this process of registration and individual taxation. Under the Act, clearer distinction was made between a Hindu's individually acquired income and any profit he accrued as a member of a huff. The former was taxed like all other income. A Hindu man had to submit accounts and was charged super tax on any earnings over 50,000 rupees. But any of his income deemed to be family wealth was dealt with wholly separately. This was combined in an estate which continued to enjoy unique super tax status. This wasn't true of any other taxpayer. A member of a firm or a company shareholder was taxed on all his income collectively, with share profits combined with any other earnings. As one civil servant explained, the new Act, quote, allows the member of a Hindu undivided family a privilege that it allows no one else. He's treated as combining in his own person two entities, his personal entity and his membership of his family. Far from reflecting preference for Hindu merchants, this was a result of the administration's attempts to tax as much of the profits made by the Hindu family firm as possible. Yet the administration's tax policy also had some important side effects. At moments, the special treatment of the huff allowed Hindu representatives to secure a political platform for their economic interests and to exercise greater leverage over the legislative process. A brief note in the report of the Income Tax Committee, the committee established to draw up the 1922 Act, illustrates this point. In drafting the new income tax bill, the committee proposed that an individual be allowed to deduct the cost of life insurance from his taxable income. When it circulated this suggestion, the committee received a request that special allowances be made for Muslims who, because of religious objections to life insurance, couldn't avail themselves of this tax privilege. Compensation of this kind would lessen rather than augment the tax yield, and the request was declined. But when the bill came to be debated in the legislature, Hindu representatives argued that as both a domestic and business structure, the huff should also be allowed to deduct the cost of life insurance from its taxable income. This would allow a Hindu family to protect its members in line with its unique social role, a role that wasn't required of companies and firms. Whereas the request for a Muslim representatives was refused flat out, the Hindu demands for tax exemption were incorporated into the 1922 Act. From the government's point of view, permitting a small cost of life insurance to be deducted from a huff tax assessment was a price worth paying to hold the entity together and thus maintain high taxation yields in the long run. This provides quite a particular perspective from which to understand the interwar debates about Hindu law reform and ultimately the Hindu Code Bill project. That the drive to codify and clarify Hindu legal structures coincided with state expansion and India's transition to democracy was no mere coincidence. The two systems, democratic representation and Hindu family law, were intrinsically linked. The taxation policies that were developed in order to fund political representation drew Indian state structures into a very particular relationship with urban propertied Hindus, a relationship that wasn't replicated with any other community. On the one hand, these policies emphasised the peculiarly joint structure of the Huff, so as to tax it in a manner that meant that Hindus paid more tax than their non-Hindu counterparts. But these policies also brought some advantages. Over the course of the interwar years, Hindu professionals and merchants were able to establish a very strong position within the state, emerging as a lobby whose interests needed to be listened to and at times placated by the colonial administration, so long as they didn't endanger too far the unity of the Hindu family. This bond between the Hindu community and Indian state structures was further affirmed with partition and the division of the subcontinent along religious lines. Independence didn't free Hindu families from their particular tax burden. The project of nation building that followed independence meant that the post-colonial state was as keen as its predecessor to collect as much income tax as possible and continue to rely heavily on the Hindu family. What was transformed by independence was the way in which the Huff was seen in official policy. Through a series of legal reforms, including and most notably the Hindu Code Bill, the Hindu family was recast, not as a hoarding and uncivic structure as colonial officials had argued, but as a key economic building block for the Indian state. And I'd like to end by showing you this, which is the first page of the income tax form issued by the Government of India this year. There's two forms issued, one for companies and registered bodies, and one for private bodies, that is, individuals and Huffs only. I hope you can see, for individuals and Huffs. This, I think, tells us something about the way in which citizenship is constructed in the world's largest democracy. If taxation and representation are linked, the Indian body politic is imagined not simply as a collective of tax-paying individuals, but as a collective of propertied Hindu families. So, thank you.
Great, some questions?
Where do Muslims fit into this? And I was kind of, I guess, showing my ignorance. I was kind of shocked at that 2000. Oh, nice little, that's great from 1883. Or
No.
And then it's 2009.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, in one sense, I've rushed you through quite a lot of legislation there, and one of the things that sort of comes through is when the 1886 Act is drawn up, actually Huff is used to really talk about Indian family firms in general. And so I actually haven't looked at that period, but Ritu Birla's book seems to suggest that actually a Muslim family firm would be taxed on a similar basis. But what begins to happen after 1916, as there's more pressure being put on those firms, the government has to back up what it's doing. And so as they say, this isn't our fault, this is Hindu law, that means that Muslim families begin to be treated very differently. And over the course of the 1930s, I've actually looked at case law, and you see tax collectors really putting the pressure on Hindu families who are trying to register themselves as partnerships, not as families themselves. There's cases where families actually undertake partition of the family estate and then register themselves as individual partners in a firm. And the state goes through and says, no, that doesn't matter. I mean, they systematically show how you're Hindus, therefore you belong to a Huff, and we're going to tax you on this basis. So actually, in one sense, this move towards a bracketed system really comes with much heightened surveillance, and therefore it becomes a much more specifically Hindu kind of a project. So, if that answers the question.
I'd like to ask a bit about the straw man with which you opened your talk, which invoked these ideas of secularism and democracy in the context of this linking of income tax and ostensibly religious institution, the Huff. And I'm curious here because it seems that pretty quickly the ironies pile up in terms of the way in which, as I said, an ostensibly religious entity like the Hindu Undivided family, actually by the period that you're talking about, seems to be pretty well entrenched as a more of a legal or very politicized identity, and that the religious quality of it, after all, was sort of stripped away and homogenized long before this period at a certain level, right? So they adopt, so the British have introduced this system of where, we're gonna take this text as the basis for calculating income tax and understanding the joint family. This one particular thing, all of the diversity of joint families that existed, probably even still in the time period that you're talking about, had been legally effaced or elided. But still now the Hindus are put in a legal position where they have to try to do their best to game the system, right? To sort of keep their income tax low, and so they participate in a sense in a legal identity that is a purported religious identity in order to maximize the benefits to themselves. And so I'm curious, given if you basically accept my characterization, how that fits in with this question of secularism and democracy and
my research really began with the personal law debates, and you really do see in the interwar period there's a number of these private member bills that are introduced to change Hindu family law. And I came to the income tax debate much more recently, but I think that what really takes place in this period, actually Ritu Birla argues that it's beginning earlier than that, is that Hindu identity is being reinscribed as a legal or a kind of liberal identity. And actually, going back to this debate, to this question of Muslim law, the interwar years sees very similar kinds of pressures on property rights, that leads Muslim representatives to introduce private member bills that actually says the state has misinterpreted the Quran actually gives us greater property rights than we're being allowed. So it's sort of doing the same thing, but by invoking an overtly religious identity. And one of the things that process does is it takes Muslim representatives away from the state. The Muslim family is carved out as a domain that is religiously defined, that belongs to a community, not to the state. And of course, 47 really brings that divide through. Whereas what's going on with the Hindu debates, through design and through accident, is that Hindu legislators are having to present the Hindu family, on the one hand, as being specifically religious. The state is saying to them, look guys, we can't tax you like everyone else because you're so religious. This joint system, it's kind of based on your archaic practices, what can we do? But those debates actually serve to, as you say, to transform that into a secular identity. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is, in the 1930s, it's the debates about Muslim law that seem to be incredibly progressive. They're about giving women property rights. And I think that the passage of the 1937 Sharia Act is one of the key moments that drives the Hindu Code Bill debate. In one sense, the Hindu Code Bill is the Hindu Sharia. But when you get once the Code Bill's passed, suddenly Hindu law is modern, it's secular, it's liberal, it becomes the foundations of the world's biggest democracy, of the new tiger, and it allows for the Indian state to recast Muslims as being religious, backward, unprogressive. And it's this way in which Hinduism has become part of a liberal modernity, same but different, that I'm really interested in, and that's what the book will really kind of look at.
So, but just to follow up quickly, the real irony, or the key irony, seems to me in what you just said, is that the British blamed the Hindus for having an intractable religious law, but they were the ones who introduced that. And
absolutely. Well, and these income tax debates all the way through, you have representatives saying, but we don't want this. You're telling us that our law is weird and backwards. We don't want it. And the state's saying, you have to have it.
Yeah.
But for very clear financial rather than kind of religious interests.
But just to follow up on that, in this period there are more and more Indian legislators, as you pointed out yourself. So it is true, is it, that these were mostly British legislators who were pushing this?
On the income tax, yes.
You can say that across the board.
Yes. Well, there's certainly at the higher ends, yes, it's all being managed. Revenue, because income tax, because under the 1919 Act, income tax remains at the centre. It does remain under quite tight surveillance. There are, you do get Indian officials lower down. The tax commissioners in the provinces tend to be Indian, and actually they're backing up this system also partly because none of these tax commissioners want to go and actually calculate how many people are in a Hindu undivided family. They do say, what are you asking from us? How on earth can we do this? So there's all kinds of different motives kind of driving the whole thing.
Can I ask another question? I'm curious about this definition of who is a Hindu. So in the case law, there's this whole legal fiction that develops in the colonial period, and the idea is that, the colonial courts will call Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains,
Yeah.
we'll call them Hindu,
Yeah.
and they'll fall under Hindu law. And then there's another funny little thing that happens with a number of Muslim groups who had converted from Hinduism several centuries earlier in the sort of Western India region, like the Khojas,
Yeah.
and the Boris, and the Maimons. And they are
Maimons.
also considered Hindu for the purposes of property law and inheritance law. So what happens? Do those groups all fall under the Huff?
Well, that's,
Or
I mean,
different
this
definitions
is the
maybe?
thing that I'm currently trying to chase up, because it suddenly seems to me, here's another incentive for suddenly making as many people Hindus as possible. I mean, this is a question to ask you, but with the 1937 Act, don't kind of Khoja Muslims and Memons, aren't they brought under Sharia law, or are they allowed to keep their property law? Because I think, I mean, that's why there's such a big debate. Well, that's not why, but they are. I mean, I think that they're actually brought under the Sharia Act in 37, but there is quite a lot of debate about that. But no, I mean,
The cases I'm thinking of are earlier than that.
well, so one of the cases that I have found is that, I mean, because the other question is, which I didn't want to draw into all of this, but within Hindu law there's two schools. There's the Dayabaga law in Bengal, and there's Mitakshara law. And it's this huff that gets defined in tax law that is the Mitakshara huff. And in Bengal, actually individual property rights are acknowledged. And most of the legislators who are protesting against the Income Tax Act are from Bengal, who all say, hang on a second, but this isn't how it works. And what you do see is you see the state beginning to tax the Abaga families as a huff, defined like a compulsory. But I haven't managed to come across, I mean, to be honest, I mean, the other thing is that it's still a very small number of Hindu families that are ever assessed income tax. Yeah, I mean, and so this is definitely a legal argument rather than a kind of social argument. But the thing that's so interesting is, even though it's so small a number, the government is absolutely hell-bent on holding on to them. Well, because actually the few that they do have produce quite a lot of money. I mean, and I'm going through at the moment the state-by-state records, and it does tend to be you get a few and then suddenly you'll get kind of quite a lot at the bottom end. But I imagine that probably a lot of the converted groups probably don't earn enough to even be calculated within this. So that's why you
All of them
don't.
are very wealthy.
Okay, oh, well then, okay, well I'll have to follow that up a bit more. Yeah.
And
Sorry.
there you go.
Are you finished?
No, I've got too many.
Okay. I'm just curious, is there still this link between taxation and representation in India today, so that groups that have been militating against, like Jains and Buddhists that have been militating against being seen as Hindus, if they're not taxed according to the Hindu law bill, does that still put them at a disadvantage where they can't lobby the government in, say, the way that a Hindu family can?
Well, I was a bit of a naughty kind of throwing in taxation and representation. I've got carried away from being in America. To be honest, I don't know. I don't know enough about the current situation. But one of the other things that happens, I mean, so I think that the Hindu Code Bill is actually significant because it is about sort of setting out much more formally who owns what in a family. And actually the Code Bill is always sort of seen as a moment in which you can get this move towards a nuclear family structure that suddenly gets pulled up. And I think the income tax debates help to explain that. It helps to explain why figures like Nehru might have been more open to it, and then they get into power and they suddenly go, actually, no. And the huff is protected. I mean, that is the big thing that's changed. But the other thing that happens is you begin to get business groups lobbying, and there are a number of different tax incentives that are offered. I was actually put onto this by a friend who said everyone that she knows puts as much money as possible into the family huff, which continues to comprise only of male members. You can't have female members of a huff. A woman can inherit individual property, but she can't inherit joint property. So actually, the point is it's now there's a lot of incentives for you to identify yourself as a huff, which doesn't answer your question at all, but it would be very interesting to look at that. So yeah, I will try and get onto that.
So what you were talking about at the beginning about secular democracy actually being very influenced by, I guess, religion, reminds me a lot of the illustrative I read on civil religion. Do you find stuff like Robert Bellah or these theories of civil religion at all relevant to the case in India?
I haven't read them, so
okay.
Sorry.
No,
No, but could you expand a bit more?
Yeah, so Robert Bellah's probably his most famous one is, I think, just called On Civil Religion or something like that. In the U.S., and what he's looking at is how there's this idea that the U.S. is a secular democracy, but in fact you have a sort of civil version of some sort of theist religion that gets incorporated into the speeches people make, written into things like the Declaration of Independence. And I'm just wondering if there was a similar thing going on here where it's almost in that the Hindu element gets ushered in as sort of like a cultural element, but it is somehow connected maybe to these other religious associations that then plays itself out as a it's not, your membership isn't dependent on identifying explicitly as a member of that religion, but it has an influence. I'm not explaining his theory right now.
No. Well, I guess I would come at it from this side. So people like Talal Azad, I've been quite influenced by. So, the state determining what is religion and what is not, I think is very interesting. And I think that actually in our sort of secular world, it is politics that defines what gets counted as religion and the way in which it gets used. And I think exactly, in one sense, I will go and look at Robert Bell, because that does sound...
B-E-L-L-A-H.
Bella, thank you. Because that's also one of the things I'm interested in, the way in which kind of Hinduism becomes cultural and it stops being religious, whereas Muslim law becomes religious and I think that, that in itself, what I'm currently looking at now is the way in which those religions are constructed, the role of text in particular under the colonial state, the way in which these different religions are constructed by colonial law in the first place. So Hindu law doesn't have a text like the Sharia that it can kind of go back to. And actually you get points where Hindu legislators would love to have a Sharia. They're kind of citing all these different bits of text. So it's not always just a direct choice, it's circumstance. And I think the other thing, it is a slightly polemical point, but I think we live in an age where democracy seems to be something that you can export, and it's the panacea for all modern ills. And of course, we need to really consider that. And actually, I think where democracy comes from, its roots, its history. Of course, I'm going to promote history, but I think that that's crucial to all of that. So, but thank you very much for that reference.
Okay, one more from me. So, kind of going back to Lalita's question from the very beginning about the Muslim response to all of this, I'm wondering about Muslim and Indian Christian responses to the special position of the Haf. Have you got anything interesting?
Well, no, but I should, at the level of the state, no. That's why this kind of reference that comes in the Income Tax Committee report, where there's a lobby, and it's literally a line, and the committee say, oh, well, I guess there's this question about Islam that means that maybe we shouldn't, that affects the tax provisions in this way, but no. But I need to kind of look into that a bit more. One of the things that you do get is this argument as to whether or not the Haf is being persecuted at all, because actually, while you have companies that are allowed certain privileges and then partnerships, firms still always remain in this kind of murky area where there's no individual. You're only allowed to apply for these rebates if you submit accounts. And who is allowed to submit accounts grows over the course of this period. But if you're just a kind of a small family firm, you might actually still be taxed like the Hindu undivided family. But the fact that Hindu law is cited by the state in this way means that Hindu families are able to kind of contest it much more overtly. But I need to. But so their argument is that if you're a Muslim family firm, you can by 1920 you can simply register yourself as a partnership and avail yourself of all these different interests, of all these different tax incentives. But I haven't looked enough at how Muslims actually respond to that. And because I'm not entirely, I wonder how, if a Muslim family firm registers itself as a partnership, quite how that's seen and how that's kind of acknowledged. But the case law I'm sort of only just beginning to look at and kind of follow through. And I have read it with vested interest, sort of following the Hindu trail. But I think it seems like a kind of very rich. The thing that does feel quite amazing is that people haven't kind of looked at it already. You see, I just have become such an income tax geek. It's terrible. But I do think it's so, it draws together very personal family relationships all the way through to the kind of highest levels of state structures and funding. And so in that sense, I think it's an incredibly rich source of sort of for historians. And I would advise you all, there's just these records that are lying around that in law reports, but also in government archives that, I was pulling out these files that no one had looked at. Maybe.
Everyone's scared. Clearly,
Well, yeah,
very
yeah,
important, but also
no,
very
but-
intimidating. Very technical, but, so, well, on that note, I'll just say thank you. This has been
Yeah.
a wonderful introduction.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.